This evening, most of this matter needs no introduction. I'm founder of the school with students nearly 30 years ago. I know of no one as passionate about Giacometti, and I know many people who have followed that work with deep insight. Mercedes is somebody who has distinguished herself in her own right as a painter and a draftsperson, has drawn and painted for many years seriously with deep commitment. She has written many articles, and we're very privileged this evening to have her talking about one of her special topics, Giacometti. Let's welcome Mercedes.
Paul Mallory wrote, "A work is never necessarily finished, for he who made it is never complete, and the strength and ability he draws from it confer on him exactly the power to improve it, and so on. He draws from it what is needed to efface it and to make it again." "Each time I work," said Alberto Giacometti, "I am ready without a moment's hesitation to undo all that I did the day before, because each day I have the impression that I see further." This was Giacometti's life, this irrevocable beginning again, this voluntary life of Sisyphus. It was an effort indefatigably sustained, the all-consuming focus of his energies, the source of their regeneration. Whether I progress in failing or whether I progress in winning a tiny bit, I myself shall have gained, and the world around me shall have grown. For this he had no need to go beyond his own studio. The adventure, the great adventure, is to see something unknown appear, surge forth each day in the same face. It is greater than all the trips around the world. Giacometti's way of seeing startled the world. It captured the imagination of his peers to the most sophisticated of the avant-garde. It projected a vivid alternative to artists everywhere. Yet he was an artist alone, apart from the probabilities of fashion, non-conforming to the new. In his own eyes, he was a traditional artist. Reality for me has never been a pretext to make a work of art, but art the necessary means for me to become more aware of what I see. Hence, my position with regard to my conception of art is a completely traditional one. His means reflected this. He used the simplest, the most ancient, clay and paint, since it was never to emphasize the material that he worked, but to be rid of it. I am persuaded that painting is illusion. The reality of painting is the canvas, but a painting can only represent what it isn't, that is, the illusion of something else. Sculptural works that have never surpassed the state of being hunks of clay, there are quantities of these. Not a single tiny piece of clay should remain in a piece of sculpture. The material must have become totally transparent to the image created. To some in the art world, Giacometti's attitude may have seemed outmoded, his values obsolete. On the contrary, he was preeminently modern. His penetrating search into the nature of reality involved an extreme and contemporary self-awareness. What he represented was not merely the thing perceived, but himself in the process of apprehending it. This led to extraordinary innovations in his work. The relationship, as an entity, between himself and reality external to himself, as seen by him, he made concrete in terms of space, bringing sculpture into a sphere of representation it had never reached before. His relation to the object perceived, the space separating him from it, this remained always to be defined. Across it he pursued the object of his attention, which escaped him through layers of consciousness, holding its distance not only through the difficulties it presented to him, but through the circumstances he imposed on his quest of it. He had devoured art in all its traditions, much having passed under the scrutiny of his pencil. This brought complexities of awareness to his seeing that further separated him from the model, while expanding his means of approaching it. So the ratio was maintained. Quote, one starts by looking at the person who is posing, and little by little all the sculptures imaginable intervene between her and you. And when there is no longer any sculpture, what remains is a quantity so unknown that I no longer know who I am looking at or what I see. It was necessary always for him to reach this point, this threshold to the unknown, since, as he said, reality is the unknown and vice versa. This is why, if ever the pursuit began to slacken, to turn in his favor, he hastened to tighten the circumstances, intensify the challenge, widen the distance again. This is why, as he said to me, I'm only happy when I'm trying to do the impossible and when it is going very badly. As soon as it starts to go easily and well, it doesn't interest me anymore at all. However, there seemed little danger of that. One continues knowing that the closer one gets to the model, the more it withdraws. The distance between myself and the model has a tendency to grow increasingly, unremittingly. It's an endless quest. It is a quest that places Giacometti among those great and relentless artists who, like Cezanne, were committed to an absolute verity, who purged of indulgence, intolerant of approximation, never satisfied, engaged in the interminable process of defining and redefining that Giacometti called drawing. I believe that whether it be a question of sculpture or of painting, actually it is only drawing that counts. One must cling solely, exclusively to drawing. If one could only master drawing a little, all the rest would become possible. Drawing, this obsession with drawing, was the means by which Giacometti achieved the extraordinary reality of his compelling images. Cezanne remarked, "He who does not have a taste for the absolute contents himself with a placid mediocrity." Giacometti personifies a quest for the absolute. In the ambience of today, his struggle may seem quixotic, but it may be that in the future his work will come to be regarded as the most profound representation of our time. Have to have the lights out now. Giacometti was born in 1901 in the part of Switzerland known as the Engadine. Stampa, the village where he grew up, is a hamlet of 50 inhabitants huddled together in the Brigaglia Valley below St. Moritz and Maloja, a valley too deep to be reached by the sun during the winter months. The Giacometti house rises straight up from an historic road, the first road from the time of the Romans to connect Italy with the north through the high Alps of Switzerland. When I visited this mountain country where Alberto, with 2 brothers and a sister, spent his childhood, it was a startling revelation to me concerning his work. It is a landscape without horizontality, where the phenomenon of scale is emphasized in each spectacular relationship, a hut to a mountain, a boulder to sheer vertical descent, an alpine flower to an abyss, the tiny village in its valleyed interval of mountain. The children played on the mountainside in small grassy places cleared by the farmers for hay, between dark forest and rock, meadows slanting vertiginously over the deep chasm of the valley, and faced across it by the formidable presences of the mountains. Far below, the village crouches beside a rushing river. In the climbing forests, the trees grow very straight and slender, very tall, their rising trunks uplifted against intervals of blue distance, descending spaces of mountain. Above the timberline, masses of rock detach themselves from the trees, their forms attenuating upward into the sky, gigantic roughly molded surfaces. It is a country where contradictions of size, of height and depth, of distance, defy the grasp of human measure. In this eternal landscape, man has the sense of a precarious foothold. Alberto Giacometti's primary impression of the world outside the room of his home was one of immeasurable space and silence, of nature implacable, overpowering. As a small child, Alberto peopled this world with symbolic creatures of his fantasy, focusing on specific objects close at hand, but what lay beyond, the illimitable landscape, penetrated to the deepest realm of his consciousness, residing there until it came to the surface in his work at the height of his maturity. He writes of this time, as a child between the ages of 4 and 7, I saw in the world outside only those objects which could be useful to me for my enjoyment. These were above all rocks and trees, and rarely more than one object at a time. I remember how during 2 summers at least, I was aware among all my surroundings of but one great rock, situated at about 800 yards from the village. That rock and the things directly related to it. It was a monolithic rock, golden in color, opening into a cave at its base. The entire lower part was hollow, having been carved out by water. The opening was low and elongated, scarcely of the height we were at the time. In some places the inside was even more hollowed out than the rest, so that at the very back there was a second small cave. It was my father who pointed out this monolith one day. Enormous discovery. At once I considered the rock as a friend, a creature filled with the best of intentions toward us, beckoning to us, smiling at us, like someone previously known and found again with infinite surprise and joy. At once it became our exclusive preoccupation. From that day on, we spent there all our mornings and all our afternoons. We were 5 or 6 children, always the same and inseparable. Every morning when I woke up, I sought out the rock. I could see it from the house in its every detail, and the tiny path like a thread leading up to it. Everything else seemed vague, unimportant, with a sense of irrelevance. Inevitably, we set out along this path and never strayed from the area immediately surrounding the cave. Our first concern upon discovery of the rock was to alter the scope of its entrance. This should be nothing but a slit, just large enough for us to get through. But for me, the height of joy was to crouch in a small cave at the back. I could hardly bear it. All my desires were fulfilled. Once, I can't remember by what chance, I did stray further away than usual. Soon I found myself in a place high up. Before me, a little below among the bushes, stood an enormous black rock in the form of a narrow pointed pyramid, the sides of which fell away almost vertically. I can't express what distress and confusion I experienced at that moment. This rock struck us immediately as something alive, hostile and menacing. It threatened everything, us, our games, our cave. I felt its very existence intolerable, and at once, since I could not make it go away, I felt I must ignore it, forget it, and speak of it to no one. However, I did approach it, but with the feeling of giving in to something reprehensible, secret, something not right. With fear and repugnance, I touched it, barely with my hand. I walked round it, trembling with fear that I might find an entrance to it. No trace of any cave, which made the rock even less acceptable. But at the same time, I felt a certain relief. An opening in this rock would have complicated everything, and already I could feel the desolate sadness of our own cave if we were to become involved with another at the same time. I fled from this black rock, far from it. I never mentioned it to the other children. I ignored it and never went back to see it again. Nature was not alone in forming Alberto's childhood. From the beginning there was art. Alberto's father, Giovanni Giacometti, was a painter of wide acclaim. Having settled back in this remote village of Stampa, from which he had gone to study in Munich and later to travel extensively in Italy and France, he became a devoted husband and father. He was a fine painter in the post-impressionist tradition, a man of great sensibility and cultivation. Here in this isolated mountain village, he opened another world to his children. Art formed the basic ambience of their lives. All 3 sons reflected this in their choice of profession: Bruno as architect, Diego as sculptor and designer, and Alberto as indefatigable helper. And Alberto, his father seems to have recognized him for what he was. He gave him every encouragement, providing him with instruction, materials, travel, and financial support throughout his youth. The Giacometti house was small, dark, protected. In seeing it, one is surprised not to find the vast scale projected in many of Alberto's paintings and drawings. Those drawings, where the ornate lamp hangs above his mother's head as she prepares the meal. A bowl of fruit catches the light. The chairs and tables The chairs and tables are simple and beautiful in the vaulted room, and where through the window he dares to draw the mountains, looming improbably close, immense and familiar. Next to the house, maybe one should have shown them again, but anyway. Next to the house is his father's studio, later his own, where this quotation from Van Gogh is inscribed on the wall. However hateful and burdensome painting may be, if one is among those who have chosen it as their profession, and if one practices it with zeal, one does, after all, become a man of honor, solid and reliable. One wonders why Alberto's father chose this quotation. In contrast to the artist his son became, consumed by his obsession, indifferent to material things, living in the most primitive and austere of circumstances, however much money he earned, Giovanni Giacometti attempted to reconcile a conventional bourgeois family life with that of an artist. Perhaps this quote implies his effort was not without conflict. Was painting a torment for him which he could not forego? Or did he feel some measure of guilt concerning his profession to so appreciate Van Gogh's justification? Or had he to defend it? In any case, to Alberto's mother, this resolution of the two aspects of her husband's life was the proper one for an artist. She looked with dismay later on at her son's quite different way of life, expressing this in sardonic ways that greatly amused Alberto. "Why can't you be a good artist like your father?" she would complain. However proud she may have become of her son, she concealed this beneath her disparaging manner. When he won the Guggenheim Prize for Sculpture, she remarked to him, "At least you'll never win the Beauty Prize." And when I met his mother in 1960, I attempted to express my admiration of her son, my opinion that he was outstanding among all the artists of his time. She listened politely, remarking at the end, "Oh, you know, he's absolutely worthless around the house." This really delighted Alberto when I told him, "She treats me like a child, just like a small child." His devotion to her was boundless. In the late years, he called her from Paris at least once each day, returning to Stampa several times a year to be with her and to draw. These visits to the country of his origin formed a continuity throughout Alberto's life. It was one of the means he had to replenish himself, to return to the sources. He used these visits particularly to draw, looking forward to them when grappling with prolonged works in Paris. Drawing was the defense he had discovered very early in life. It gave him the courage to face an overpowering world, to come forth from his cave. I followed the farmers gathering hay and sketched the peasants. I drew to communicate, to dominate. My pencil was my weapon. I had the feeling that I was able to reproduce and therefore to take possession of whatever I wished. He illustrated the books and stories he read as a child. By the age of 9, he was unusually precocious in drawing from observation, as shown by a drawing of his mother. At 12, he made his first painting, and at 13, a bust in plastiline, prophetically of his brother, Diego. He was a year younger than I, so he had to stay still. How nostalgically he regarded this first head, which he kept and envied, because it was made before he had lost the footing of his innocence, before he had become afflicted with the crippling effects of his consciousness. At first I experienced the greatest pleasure, and I had the impression that everything was going to come very easily, that I would succeed in accomplishing just about exactly what I saw. I still have the small bust at home. 50 years later, I haven't succeeded. By the time Alberto had reached the age of 18, a number of his characteristics were emerging. During the summer, he started 2 landscapes, working on them all summer long, but they still remained unfinished by the fall. In late years, it became more and more difficult to complete anything until he rejected the very idea of finishing a work. By then, it was only what he was gaining in the process that mattered, not the particular work that happened to survive or to be destroyed, as the case might be. He records working on a still life at that time. Once in my father's studio, when I was 18 or 19, I was drawing some pears that were on a table at the usual still life distance, and the pears kept getting tiny. I'd begin again, and they'd always go back to exactly the same size. My father got very irritated. He said, "But start doing them as they are, as you see them." And he corrected them to life size. I tried to do it like that, but I couldn't help erasing. I erased, and half an hour later they were the same size to the millimeter as the previous ones. Compelled to reflect the truth of his perception, he could not oblige his father, whether he wished to or not. He was already responding to appearance, to the size of the pairs as they seemed to him at that distance. He did indeed draw what he saw, and not what he knew, with the same scrupulous accuracy, involuntary and unsatisfactory as it might seem even to him, that was to characterize his life's work. And typically, when he challenged this result, he inevitably arrived at the same point of truth. Another artistic characteristic had evolved by this time, the practice of copying from works of art. Always since childhood, I copied absolutely everything that fell into my hands, sculpture and painting from every period, and little by little I was drawn to just about everything that has been done. In a statement written shortly before he died, he reminisces about this. I see myself simultaneously throughout my entire past, at Stampa near a window in about 1914, absorbed in copying a Japanese print. I could still describe every single one of its details, and in 1915 Rembrandt's Supper, and then Pinturicchio suddenly comes to mind, and all the Quattrocento frescoes in the Sistine Chapel. But then also I see myself 4 years later returning to my studio in the evening in Paris, leafing through books and copying this or that Egyptian sculpture or a Carolingian miniature, and also Matisse. The entire art of the past, of all periods, of all civilizations, rises before my eyes, becomes a simultaneous vision, as though time had become space. For many years I have known that copying is the best way for me to become aware of what I see, the way it happens in my own work. In 1919, his father sent him to the École des Beaux-Arts in Geneva. My fellow students were heaping up large masses. To me, the model looked like a thread. "When are you going to build up your planes?" the professor kept asking. Impossible. He left, but subsequently attended l'École des Arts et Métiers. However, he preferred to paint at home and to make watercolors by the lake and in the surrounding countryside. In 1920, Giovanni Giacometti was appointed commissioner for Switzerland to the Venice Biennale. He took Alberto with him. In 1920, in the month of May, during my first visit to Venice, I still remember an impression I had during the trip at a small station in the hills of Brianza, the sun immense and crimson disappearing in the mist over the horizon. And on my arrival in Venice, the surprise I felt by the light and transparent gray color and by the verdigris cupola of the church across from the station. Everything had a fragile air, somewhat dilapidated. It is true that during that visit to Venice, I was impassioned by Tintoretto alone. It was an intense affection, a love I felt for him through his paintings. I spent all month rushing about through the entire city for fear that there might be a single one of his paintings hidden somewhere in the corner of a church or elsewhere. Tintoretto was a marvelous discovery for me. It was like a curtain opening onto a new world, which was the very reflection of the real world around me. I loved him with a love both exclusive and partisan. I felt only hostility and antipathy toward Veronese and Titian. Not toward Bellini. I admired him, but from a distance. He wasn't necessary to me at that moment. Tintoretto was right and the others were wrong. On the very last day, I still ran to San Giorgio Maggiore and to the Scuola San Rocco, as though to say goodbye to the dearest of friends. That very same afternoon, on entering the chapel in the arena in Padua, I was struck as though by a violent blow on the chest before the Giottos. I felt disoriented, lost. At once I felt a great sadness and intense grief. The blow had also struck Tintoretto. The force of Giotto imposed itself on me irresistibly. I was crushed by those immutable figures with the density of basalt, with their precise and appropriate gestures, their heavy expressions, often infinitely tender, as in the hand of Mary touching the cheek of the dead Christ. It seemed to me that never again would a hand be able to make a gesture other than that one in an analogous situation. The Tintorettos became vague and unconvincing, his figures making large gestures that seemed empty and superfluous. It gave me the impression of a vain desire to dominate the world. But I rebelled against giving him up. I felt guilty. Such an estrangement already taking place seemed like treason. Because of it, I felt I was losing something irreplaceable, a luminous something, a breath that was infinitely more precious than all the qualities in Giotto, despite the fact that I was persuaded he was the stronger. But on that same evening, all these contradictory sensations were superseded by the sight of 2 or 3 girls walking in front of me. They seemed to me immense, beyond all concept and measure, and all their movements appeared charged with a terrible violence. I watched them hallucinated, invaded by a sensation of terror. It was a sort of rending of reality. The meaning and relation of things, everything was altered. The Tintorettos and Giottos, both at the same time, became very small and weak, soft, insubstantial, like naive stammering utterances, timid and inept. And yet what bound me so much to Tintoretto was a sort of pale reflection of this apparition, so that I understood why I absolutely did not want to lose him. This same luminous quality I found again the following autumn in Florence, much more powerfully, in an Egyptian bust, the first head that seemed true to life, and in the Cimabues at Assisi, which filled me with immense joy, and a bit later in the mosaics of Cosimo and Damiano in Rome. All these works seemed to me like reconstituted doubles of the 3 girls in Padua. It's the same quality that has since fascinated me in Cezanne, and which places him, as far as I am concerned, in a unique position among all the painters of the last few centuries. This reminiscence was written at a time when the nature of this apparition of the 3 girls in Padua was integral to his personal vision, coming to full realization in his work. Was it the first time he had been struck by this hallucinatory sensation? Was this induced by the intense impact of his discovery of Tintoretto and Giotto? Was it a sort of violent reversion to a sense of reality of his own? Or, since this account was written after a similar and crucial rending of reality in 1945, did he not project back to the earlier experience some of the character of the later one? All these questions come to mind but can no longer be answered. Alberto returned to Italy in the fall and settled in Rome. I stayed in Rome for 9 months and never had enough time to do all I wanted to do. I wanted to see everything, and at the same time I painted figures and landscapes in a somewhat pointillist manner. Also I began 2 heads, one small, and for the first time I couldn't get anywhere at all. Everything eluded me. The head of the model in front of me became like a cloud, vague, without any limits. I ended up by destroying them both at the end of my stay. I spent a good deal of my time in the museums, the churches, the ruins. I was particularly attracted to the mosaics and the Baroque. I remember each sensation in front of each thing I looked at. I filled sketchbooks with copies. Another allusion to that same period gives a slightly different impression. I was in the state of mind of a rich young idler. My father was sending me a monthly allowance, but the bank made a mistake and sent me twice the agreed amount. At this time, a traumatic event occurred in Alberto's life. He was on a train to Pompeii from Paestum. In the compartment was an elderly man from Holland, a librarian at The Hague. As so often happens on European trains, the 2 entered into conversation together. Later, when Alberto was in Stampa, a friend sent him a newspaper clipping in which this Hollander was trying to establish contact with the young man he had met on the train in Italy. I assumed he had lost something, so I wrote him a note. He wrote back suggesting that I accompany him on a new trip. He found me a pleasant companion. He was old and lonely. I always longed to go to Venice. I was poor and he would be paying. Well, while we were going through a pass in the Tyrol, he caught a cold. The next morning he was banging his head against the wall in agony. He had a kidney stone. They gave him injections, and I spent the whole day sitting at his bedside reading. It was raining hard. From time to time he would mumble, "Tomorrow I'll be better." But toward the evening, I had the impression that his nose was getting longer. He was having difficulty in breathing, and his cheeks seemed to have sunken in. I was getting very frightened. Then the doctor came. "This is it," he said. "The heart is failing. By this evening he will be dead." To me this seemed like some grotesque practical joke, the negation of everything I had wanted to believe about death. I had visualized it as a solemn adventure, and it turned out to be nothing but this: negligible, laughable, absurd. Within a few hours the old Dutchman had become a mere thing, nothing. But from that moment death became a constant possibility for me and for everyone. Since then I have never been able to sleep without a light, nor to go to bed without the thought crossing my mind that I might never wake up. The more my mind dwells on that nightmarish time, the more certain I feel that it is because of the Dutchman that I have always lived in a provisional way, that I have never overcome my aversion to possessions. To buy a house, to set oneself up for good with such a threat hanging over one all the time? No, I'd rather live in hotels and cafes and places where people simply come and go. This impression remained with Giacometti throughout his life, finding expression in his work some 25 years later in Head of a Man on a Rod. It was then also that he recorded it for the first time in writing as part of his essay, The Dream, the Sphinx, and the Death of Tea. Already in 1920, Giovanni Giacometti had recognized his son's commitment. For him there is no other profession than that of sculptor or painter. He lives it to the utmost. He wanted to give Alberto the best opportunity to study. In 1922, he decided to send him to Paris to the Grand Sommière, where Bourdelle, a pupil of Rodin, was teaching. Alberto was reluctant to go. According to him at that time, it was not work but pleasure that appealed to him. In Vienna, there was a drastic inflation that would have transformed his modest allowance of Swiss francs into a fortune. It was to Vienna that he wanted to go. Furthermore, he had a preconception about France. My image of France was that of a black, tragic country, a police state, because I had read too many spy stories, and because in every official photograph, the Président de la République was dressed in black amidst the bright uniforms of visiting royalty. I was an obedient son, so I went, but I was convinced that I was heading for disaster. Of course, once in Paris, he remained there for the rest of his life. After 3 years of living in hotels where people simply come and go, he took a studio, Rue Foy de Vaux, and 2 years later, quite provisionally, a very tiny one, on the Rue Hippolyte Mantois, where he stayed for the remaining 40 years of his life. It's funny, when I took this place in 1927, I thought it tiny. It was the first place I found. I had no choice. I planned to move as soon as I could because it was too small, just a hole. But the longer I stayed, the larger it grew. As soon as he arrived in Paris and started to work in Bourdelle's class, he found himself suffering the same frustration he had known when confronting a model in Rome. In the morning I did sculpture, and the same difficulties began that I had experienced in Rome. In the afternoon I drew. I could no longer bear sculpture without color, and often tried to paint them from nature. It was impossible to grasp the ensemble of a figure. We were much too close to the model, so that if one started on a detail, a head or a nose, there was no hope of ever arriving at the whole. But if, on the other hand, one began by analyzing the detail, the end of the nose, for instance, one was lost. The form disintegrated. It consisted of little more than specks moving about in a deep black void. The distance between one nostril and the other became like the Sahara. There was no fixed point, no limitation of view. Everything escaped. I became aware that my vision had changed each day. Either it was a volume that I saw, or I saw the figure as a blob, or I saw a detail, or I saw the ensemble. Since the model posed for only a very limited time, he had left before one had even begun to grasp whichever way it was. Bourdelle himself seemed to have had varied reactions to Alberto's work. One day, Bourdelle looked at the sculpture I was doing and called the other students. "Look at this sculpture," he said. "There are few things in the Louvre better than this. You must cast it right away." But instead I continued to work on it. 2 weeks later, Bourdelle looked at it again. He said, "Young man, do you think sculpture is really your vocation?" Although Giacometti remained at the Grand Chaumière for 5 years, he was not there continuously. I was at the Academy 5 years. The second year, it happened that I came across a skull, and they lent it to me. I had such a desire to paint it that I stayed away from the Academy during the entire winter, and I spent the whole winter in a hotel room painting the skull, trying to find out all about it, to understand it in every possible way. I spent days trying to find the origin of a tooth, the attachment, which goes very high up next to the nose, to follow this as closely as possible in its entire movement, to such a point that if I had had any idea of being able to realize the skull in its entirety, this no longer seemed feasible. Still today I regret not having gone through with this to the end. Even if he never went as far as he wished he had, a drawing and a painting of the skull seemed to me Giacometti's most remarkable early works, and those which most presaged the mysterious sense of presence that was to characterize the later work. Toward the end of the 5 years during which he worked from a model at the Grand Chaumière, he worked without one at home, from memory. It was necessary for him to get outside of the class situation to find out where he was, what he had learned. As I wanted nevertheless to realize the little I understood and saw, I began in desperation to work from memory at home. I tried to save the little I could from this catastrophe. After many sketches bordering on cubism, one had necessarily to touch on it. This brought about objects which seemed to me the nearest I could get to my vision of reality. I started by wanting to realize as much as possible from memory of what I'd seen, so that I damned well started with a fully articulated figure, with legs, a head, arms, and it all seemed false to me. I didn't believe in it. To make it true, I had gradually to sacrifice, to reduce, to let go of the head, the arms, everything. Of the whole figure, only a plaque, a slab remained, and this was never voluntary nor satisfying, quite the contrary. I was always disappointed to see that what I could really master in terms of form reduced itself to so slight a thing. I started 2 or 3 pieces, and they always got to the same point. They always came to the same thing. As one can see, Giacometti worked from a level in himself beyond the control of his will, where his response to experience took the necessary time of gestation before it came to the surface in his work. These pieces done from memory, these plaques, were not only, as he intended them to be, a summary of what he had gained from his studies thus far, but reflected the impact of Paris and its influence toward a break with the entire direction of his work until then. Until now, this had been basically rooted in the conception he had absorbed from his father and largely sustained during the years at the Academy. These plaques represented, that's too soon, these plaques represented not only a break with his past, but brought about a radical change in his life by altering his status from student to that of professional artist. Not that he had any desire to go in for art as a career. I was simply a young man who wanted to have a fling at it, to see what would happen. As long as my father paid my way, I never had the slightest intention of presuming to be a professional artist. But after 5 years in Paris, he said I ought to give it a try. I decided to take 2 plaques to the Jean Boucher gallery. A week later, they were both sold, and on my table were 3 offers for contracts. In a way, I was happy because of my father, but I said to myself, how can these people accept what I do so quickly, and it's such trash? Giacometti's success was sudden. It had the immediate effect of bringing him into contact with other artists. From being a solitary student in an alien city, he became overnight part of the Paris scene. This gave him a sense of belonging, as though I had always lived in Paris. Living there these 5 years had exposed him to the challenge of many influences before he had become a part of the artistic community of Paris, long before he had abandoned his persistent studies from observation. His agile intelligence, with its penchant for the paradoxical, must have felt the pull of new and conflicting points of view, must have been led to question and to doubt. Yet he continued his studies, allowing the rebellion within him to ripen, until one day, while a friend was posing for him, he said to himself, "Never, even in 1,000 years, will I be able to do a head that will look even approximately like a real head." With that he made the break. It was radical. It was, in fact, a sort of reversal of everything. Later on, he referred to this decision repeatedly as one of defeat, a failure to cope with the complexities of visual perception. But in light of Alberto's character, as demonstrated throughout his life, it must have been... I'm stuck to this tape, Christian. It must have been less the impossibility of the task about the growing lack of conviction. It must have been less the impossibility of the task than the growing lack of conviction concerning it that brought about this break. Liberated, he saw before him now a world of directions to explore. I tried every experiment of construction until about 1935. Isn't there another? Yes. Yeah. To me, the word experiment means to explore outside of one's own most deeply determined course. Kafka writes, 2 tasks at the beginning of your life, to narrow your orbit more and more, and ever and again to check whether you are not in hiding somewhere outside your orbit. If indeed it was outside his orbit, he was free to follow any direction he chose. In assuming a conceptual approach, he seemed to become a polarity to the artist he essentially was within the context of his life as a whole. Instead of the daily life he had led before, he now spent a great deal of time about Paris with his new friends, the Surrealists. Of all the people he met, they interested him the most. The entirely subjective realm of experience, which was their concern, offered him the new direction he needed. He formally joined their group. No longer, he wrote, was it the external form of things that interested me, but what I felt in an affective sense within my life. During all the previous years, the years of the academy, there had been a disagreeable contrast for me between life and work, one getting into the way of the other, and I found no way to resolve this. To reconcile these 2 aspects of his life, he needed subject matter that offered him direct access to his feelings, his sensuality, his dreams. Now he permitted himself the leisure to live, focusing his attention inwardly, taking cognizance of experience. In order to do this, he had to rid himself of the cumbersome procedure that got so in the way of living, interminably absorbing him in the studio. Now, he wrote, the only satisfaction is to achieve something exactly as one imagined it. One feels the need to see it realized. If it could be carried out by someone else, it would be quite as satisfactory. It is almost a bother to make it. Here was the dramatic change in Giacometti's life. This new relation to his work, during all his life before and after this period, it was his work that despotically governed his days, providing him at the same time with the very raison d'etre of his existence as an artist. It was his identification between seeing and response, experience and expression, that formed the continuum in which he lived, so that he never ceased to work, at least to draw, whether in a museum or a café, in Stampa or the Rue Hippolyte Mandron. This stopped entirely. He was young. He relegated his work to another role in a life he now felt free to live. Before 1925, Giacometti had worked in materials appropriate to change, malleable materials such as clay, paint, pencil, charcoal, etc. These lent themselves to the countless revisions, the putting in and taking away, the shifting, defining and redefining, the almost realizing and then destroying that formed the content of his days. Now, on the contrary, since nothing unpredictable was to take place, he could render the image conceived, construct it in wood or metal, and finish it. He writes during this decade, "For years now, I have only executed those sculptural works that have presented themselves to my imagination in a state of completion. I have limited myself to reproducing them in space without changing anything, without asking myself what they could mean. It would suffice for me to undertake the modification of a single part, or that I should have to seek a single proportion for me to become completely lost and for the object to be entirely destroyed." This goes to show the extreme Giacometti reached in contrast to his habitual approach, referred to in a typical remark such as this: "The more you fail, the more you succeed. When all is lost and yet still you keep going, instead of giving up, then you experience that one moment when there is a chance to get a little further." Often he contrasted the two ways of working, one almost naively simple when compared with the complexity and difficulty of the other. Asked whether he had some particular dimension of his own in sculpture, he answered, "There is perhaps not one size, but two. If I visualize my piece in advance as though completed, which is what is done by almost everyone in modern sculpture, and which I did myself for a time, the object is formed in one's imagination, and little by little one visualizes it in its material and in its size. The size depends on the requirement, in an affective sense, of the object. Its realization is but physical labor, which presents no difficulty whatsoever, at least for me. Whereas, on the contrary, if, instead of wanting to achieve something purely subjective, I want to try to realize something which is outside of me, say a woman from nature, then the question of size presents itself in a totally different way, because I don't know at all what I am going to do. The thing I'm looking at, I see it, I feel it, but I am completely ignorant of the way in which I can realize it, so that there is a good chance that I will start by making a mistake about the size. In rendering what one sees, size plays an enormous role. It's enough to be 5 centimeters off one way or the other to miss out entirely." It was inevitable that he questioned the nature of representation itself, particularly as regards the two ways of working. In wanting to express oneself without at all taking external reality into account, one ends up by making an object that bears a resemblance to external reality. Whereas, if one wants to copy a head as closely as possible, for instance, to the spectator the result will bear no resemblance whatsoever to the head one wanted to reproduce. It will have reflected the sensibility of the person who made it. So it finds its paradox. Paradoxically again, when Giacometti worked from imagination as a surrealist, his aim was to isolate the affectivity itself of the image. In my opinion, he never achieved this during the Surrealist period, whereas later, in a portrait bust, a woman standing, a painting of his mother, he did. When he worked to achieve objects that were purely affective, they were beautiful as constructions. When he worked to construct an exact reflection of what he saw, the result often reached the hallucinating degree of affectivity he had sought in the Surrealist works. Again, this seems to me explained by the two ways of working. The evolution of the Surrealist works took place in his imagination, but between their conception and realization, the crucial factor of duration in the actual work of creation was lacking. Through the tips of his fingers as he molded clay, through the sensitive scannings and probings of his pencil or brush, through the ineffable flux of his perception as he looked, the work became saturated with resonances of feeling the Surrealist objects never attained. Giacometti's way of working from observation has often been described by those who posed for him, and there is a film showing him at work. But with the earlier works, only he could trace their origins in his imagination. He did this in a statement about the palace at 4 a.m., perhaps the most beautiful of all his constructions. Once an object is constructed, I tend to discover impressions, events that have profoundly moved me, often unconsciously, forms that are familiar, transformed and displaced, though I may not be able to identify them, in which case they are always more disturbing. I take as an example the sculpture reproduced here, which represents a palace. This object formed itself in my mind little by little at the end of the summer of 1932. Gradually it became clarified for me, its diverse elements taking their exact form and their precise location in the whole. When autumn arrived, it had taken on such a reality that its execution took me only a day. It related without question to a period of my life which had ended a year earlier, a period of 6 months where hour after hour was spent with a woman in whom was concentrated all of life and who transformed each instant for me into something marvelous. We constructed a fantastic palace during the night. The nights and days had the same colors, though everything happened at the moment of dusk before dawn. I never saw the sun that whole time. A palace precariously fragile of matchsticks. At the least false move, a whole section of this minute structure would collapse. We would always start building it over again. I don't know why it came to be inhabited by the spinal cord of a bird, such as this woman gave me on one of the very first nights that I met her in the street, the spine of one of the bird's skeletons that she saw the very night before the morning on which our life together came to an end. The skeletal birds that flew very high over the pool of pale green water in which swam the fine white skeletons of fish in the great hall to cries of wonder at 4 o'clock in the morning. In the center rises the scaffolding of a tower as yet incomplete, or perhaps damaged, destroyed at the top. The statue of a woman came to place itself on the other side, a statue in which I recognized my mother, just as she figures in my earliest memories. Her long black skirt touching the floor disturbed me with its mystery. It seemed a part of her body which gave me a sense of fear. All the rest loses itself, escapes my attention. 3 times this figure emerges from the curtain I saw the very first time I opened my eyes. Prey then to an irresistible charm, I gazed at this brown curtain, under which, along the length of the floor, gleamed a thin strip of light. I can say nothing about the object on the red base. I identify myself with it. During this period, writing, poetry and prose became a second vehicle of expression for Giacometti. He was always a master of words. Acceptance and insight into his works was often initiated by his own writing. We can be grateful for the many verbal articulations of his experience, his way of seeing, his self-awareness, which have made his entire consciousness as much a part of the heritage he has left as his work. The permanent effect of this period with the Surrealists was the consciousness it brought him, the self-awareness, the use of free association in its pursuit. The temporary effect was an involvement in the social and political activities demanded of adherents of the group. Giacometti's presence was strongly felt not only as sculptor, but through his writing and his extraordinary personality. In 1934, André Breton wrote, "What is Surrealism? It is, among other things, Alberto Giacometti's battle with the angel of the invisible, who made an appointment with him among the blossoming apple trees." As a result of being so prominent a figure in the group that dominated the Paris scene, it was now perhaps this once during all his life that Giacometti was affected by the temptations of success. At least he urges one to believe so in a statement written later as he looked back on this time. In spite of oneself, one yields to external considerations. One wants to arrive, to succeed. One enters into competition. One works to shock, or one repeats oneself. "Make variations," they would say to me when I was stuck or discouraged. I was certainly on the slippery slope. From 1925 to 1935, during the entire voyage outside his orbit, even through the deep waters of Surrealism, I think he knew he had gone off his course. Even during the time I belonged to the Surrealist group, I had experiences I felt to be merely transitory. It was terrifying to me to imagine that one fine day I would just have to sit myself down on a stool again in front of a model. I felt that in one way or another I would get to that. Of a work done in 1924, he wrote, "That sculpture, invisible object, which Breton preferred to all the rest, upset my whole life again. I was satisfied with her hands and her head because they were just as I intended them to be. But I wasn't at all satisfied with the legs, the body, and the breasts. They seemed too academic, too conventional. That made me want to work for life again." The time of return was approaching. It finally came through a revelation that struck him while working for Michel Frank, an interior decorator for whom he and Diego, in need of money, had agreed to make some objects. It became evident to Alberto that his process of making these was no different at all from that of his own work. This shocked him. Objects, he realized, were not sculpture. In Stampa, Giacometti gave us a beautiful dissertation about this over lunch. An object, he said, taking hold of the wine bottle, is perfect in itself. A work of art can never be perfect, since it represents a particular vision, only one view of reality, while so many others are equally valid. But if a bottle breaks, it is nothing at all, whereas a work of art, broken, damaged, so long as it still projects the vision it represents, continues to exist. An object does not represent a vision, it is merely a thing in itself. In 1935, Giacometti decided that what he had been doing was nothing other than making objects. As far as my intention was concerned, sculpture was something other than an object. Therefore, I had failed. I had circumvented the mystery. It was the last stop before reaching the wall. No further progress was possible. My work was not a creation. It was no different from that of a carpenter making a table. It was necessary to return to the sources and to start all over again. This was in 1935. Giacometti decided to do a composition of figures. In preparation, he thought it a good idea to hire a model for a week or two, just to get back in touch. He worked from the model all day, every day, from 1935 to 1940. At once he found himself back in the dilemma from which he had extricated himself 10 years before, but as though unwittingly, as though in making the decision to take a model, he had been innocent of the problems it would entail. From the very beginning, he gave up any presumption of doing an entire figure. He concentrated only on the head. Twice a year, he started 2 heads, only to arrive 6 months later at the same point. Nothing was realized. Returning to the model meant giving up the preconception of the object, and this meant returning to means that could yield change: clay, plaster, paint. Again, he found himself bound to a procedure without respite. The fact that he was working from a model, trying to do heads, made him a heretic, according to André Breton, Pope of the Surrealists. "Everyone knows what a head looks like," Breton scornfully proclaimed. Giacometti was dropped from the group, so that in returning to his previous trials, he lost all his friends as well. He went underground, no longer exhibiting, solitary. He focused himself on the effort that was to be his life from that time on. The sense he had of dispersal, of things dissolving as he looked at them, escaping all measure, losing any tangible form to grasp. These sensations tormented him through the years. It was as though, in order to create, he had always to start at the very beginning, as in the creation in Genesis, where the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. To wrest from the threatening void one particle of life, which he presumed to do, was the total act of creation. And with creation came destruction. He was working mostly in plaster. The pile of rubble in the corner of his studio of works destroyed grew enormous. But there was no longer any pressure from the outside. He could work for his own private satisfaction now, without worrying about whether or not he produced. He worked again, he said, just as though he were a student at the academy. The first 5 years were but a prelude of what was to come. Emerging from this seemingly thankless effort, he decided to work from memory to find out exactly where he was. This was in 1940. Then the full drama of his struggle began to unfold. The only foothold he could manage to establish within the yawning abyss of space was frighteningly precarious. To my horror, the sculptures became smaller and smaller, They were only true to life when small. However, this size revolted me, and tirelessly I would start again, only to arrive after several months at the same point all over again. A large figure seemed to me untrue, a small one intolerable, and often they became so small that with one touch of my knife they disappeared into dust. Giacometti spent several years during the war in Geneva working in his hotel room on these diminishing figures. At the end of the war, when he was leaving for Paris, his friend Skira asked him if he had already shipped his sculpture to Paris. "No, I'm taking them with me," he answered, pulling 6 matchboxes out of his pockets, which contained all the work of those years. I was fed up. I swore I wouldn't let my figures diminish by so much as the fraction of an inch. Then something else happened. I kept the proper height, but it all started to get so thin. They only became true to life when elongated and slender. I was disappointed, in fact, desperate. Again, he found the result of his struggle against dispersal unsatisfying. Far from its being, as many thought, a voluntary style, it was the best he could do at that time to approach reality as he saw it. "I find the more I construct, the more I compress," he explained. This was in 1946, the beginning of a period of great realization. Even though he still remained dissatisfied, it was at this time, between 1946 and 1952, that his vision became crystallized. The impact of it astounded the world. Issued in dramatically by what he called a rending of reality, he saw as in a vision, his vision. I was at a newsreel theater in Montparnasse when it all started. Suddenly I couldn't follow anymore what was happening on the screen. People and objects on the screen became mere blobs, black and white blobs without meaning. Turning away from the screen, I started looking at the people around me. It was a completely unknown sight. The unknown, the mysterious, was the reality around me, no longer what was on the screen. When I was outside again on the boulevard, I had the impression that reality had completely changed. It was something never seen before, something totally unknown, fantastic, marvelous. The boulevard Montparnasse was like something out of the 1001 Nights, and at the same time silence settled over everything, an incredible silence. Silence and immobility invaded reality. Emotion seemed to me like a succession of immobile moments, separated by abysses of emptiness, by eternities of silence. Again and again he refers to this traumatic and marvelous sensation. In The Dream, The Sphinx, and The Death of Tea, he writes, "At that time I began to perceive heads as they are in the void, the space surrounding them. The first time I definitely saw the head I was looking at congeal, become in that instant of time transfixed irrevocably. I trembled with a terror I had never felt before. But at the same time that human beings did, objects also underwent a transformation. Tables, chairs, the street, even trees and landscapes. That morning when I woke up and saw my towel for the first time, a towel without weight and motionless as never seen before, and as though suspended in a frightful silence. It had no relation anymore to the table, the legs of which no longer stood on the floor, nor barely touched it. There was no longer any relation between objects, separated as they were by immeasurable gulfs of void. I looked at my room in fear, and a cold sweat ran down my back. I believe it was now, 12 years later, that the essence of Giacometti's surrealist experience came to the surface in his work. And to me, it was he who captured the singular sensation, the particular sense of reality of surrealism, more movingly than had any artist, because he translated it more profoundly into art. It was not an obvious surrealist juxtaposition of images presented or illustrated. It was the feeling itself that mysteriously pervaded his figures, and even the space around them. Now he did isolate the affectivity itself of an image. It hovered there without being tied to any literary or explainable subject matter. In the unbearable light of hallucination, these haunting presences, charged with terrible emotion, detach themselves from context, imprinting themselves in the mind of the spectator as in the memory of a dream. Their awful stillness, was it not a silence from far beneath the surface of conscious thought, far, far removed from the sounds and activities of the outside world? And yet this happened only after his conscious attention had returned to the world outside, to the utmost concentration on things observed. Apparently it needed this focus, the struggle with the elusive phenomena of appearance, and above all the process into which this drew him again, for the magical world of his unconscious to take possession of his images and to transfigure them into these astounding realizations. It was not only his experience of surrealism that formed these works. All his life's experience seemed to come together at this time, to fuse in forming his vision. The surface of his sculpture became that of the mountains of Stampa. Extended busts of Diego rose in craggy modulations up to the crest of his head, vastly distant, with a sense of overpowering imminence. The figures of women grew vertically from their bases as the tall, slender trees of Stampa, though they stood apart from one another, separated by intervals of space, interstices of silence, vast as those that set apart the presences of the mountains. From the depths of his consciousness, nature, as he had absorbed it from the beginning, came to impregnate his work, to magnify his images. The trauma of his first encounter with death, the precarious sense of existence that had spread over all his life, became a part of every affirmation. The Dutchman's death, after all the years, found expression in the head of a man on a rod in 1947, a work I find the most beautiful, the most terrible and inescapable image of death I have seen. All the knowledge and understanding of art gathered through the years and culminating in his grasp of Cezanne, not only this artist means, as with the Cubists and the Abstractionists, but with the direction of his intent, all this came together to fortify his work, to give him the powerful tools he needed to realize his vision. But there was a certain contradiction in all these elements, a polarity between the effective demand of his vision, the sense of an hallucinating image, isolated, out of context, and seeing with the burden of consciousness of Cezanne, where the particular object of attention becomes dissolved into fragments with its context, losing its separate integrity through a relativity that reconstitutes the whole of both thing and context. All this together provided the challenge of impossibility that Giacometti found so fertile. Speaking of Cezanne, he pointed out that Cezanne threw a sort of bomb into the representation of the world outside, valid since Giotto, by painting a head like an object, by establishing more relation between the left ear and the background than with the right ear, more relation between the color of the hair and the color of the sweater than with the shape of the skull. He exploded the concept that had existed before him of the unity of a head. Any representation that wishes to return to the vision that preceded his, it would belong to the museums. Cezanne himself elucidates this. Nature is in depth. Between the painter and his subject, a plane interposes itself, the atmosphere. The atmosphere forms the immutable base on the screen of which all the oppositions of color, all the accidents of light become decomposed. And he goes on to say, it constitutes the outer shell of the picture in contributing to its synthesis and its general harmony. This relation to the world observed is specifically concerned with appearance. Giacometti explained that the whole approach of modern artists is to try to grasp the sensation of reality rather than reality itself. In any case, one cannot possess everything. What one may perhaps be able to possess is appearance, only that. Of reality, only appearance remains. He describes his own working from observation. One might imagine that realism consists in copying a glass just as it is on the table. But in fact, one never copies anything but the vision that remains at each instant, the image that becomes conscious. You never copy a glass on the table, you copy the residue of a vision. When I look at the glass, its color, its form, its light, at each glance only a small part reaches me, which is very difficult to determine, which can be translated by a very small line, a very small spot. Every time I look at the glass, it gives the impression of reforming itself. That is to say that its reality becomes questionable, because its projection into my brain becomes questionable or partial. One sees it as though it were disappearing, appearing again, disappearing, reappearing. That is to say that it is damned well always between being and non-being, and that is what one wants to copy. The entire approach of modern artists is to seize, to capture something that escapes continually. This response to perception reveals not only Giacometti's Cezannean approach in terms of process, but reflects his participation in the philosophical consciousness of his time, his awareness of phenomenology, and in a deeper sense, as an artist, this man transplanted to the center of culture in the modern world, was exquisitely attuned to the essential dilemma of modern man, and most profoundly among artists, imbued his work with this sense. However, he denied any concern with the metaphysical, presuming in his effort to grasp a reality forever fugitive to go no further than the first point of contact, that of appearance. This was as true in his sculpture as in his drawing and painting. He brought his response to appearance, to the frontality of space vis-à-vis the eyes of the observer, into sculpture much as Cezanne had brought it to full consciousness in painting. Thus Giacometti moved sculpture toward the domain of painting. Sculpture as illusion, as representing appearance, meant its being fixed at a specific distance from the observer, meant its appropriation of a defined space rendered concrete and inviolable, and within this established boundary by means not necessarily coincident with the physical actuality of the piece, but by projection, bringing about the phenomenon of scale to the whole, both to the object and the space. Thus the space might seem immense, the figure within it small, or the figure might seem large within a space more vast. Sculpture as appearance meant frontality, projection, not continuous volume. It lent itself naturally to color to heighten the illusion. I'm looking at a head of Diego made in 1950. There is no frame of reference to create a sense of its distance. Oh. Yeah, I guess so. No, after that. But how did that get in front of the other? It's way behind it. There. There is no frame of reference to create a sense of its distance or proximity, yet it has a location that does not change from wherever one sees it. Upon first seeing Giacometti's work, I thought this sense of distance, a far-awayness, a generalized feeling, a sort of emotional ambience, and a tour de force to accomplish. I did not immediately realize the simple fact that it was the representation, the precise representation of the appearance, or rather his sensation of the appearance of the model, at the distance separating him from it. This became clear to me in the case of a larger bust of Diego, which I saw for the first time at the Guggenheim Museum in 1952, across a tremendous space several galleries away. It was startlingly close to me. As I drew nearer, it never got any closer, nor did it ever get further away, however far I walked in the opposite direction. This had never been done in sculpture before. As I look at this head of Diego, I find it forever unfathomable. That's right. So much more is there than is explained by its physical actuality. Of that there is just enough pressed together into a sort of core, a core of existence, to create an illusion. By this configuration of marks, of small crevices and protrusions, of subtly painted gradations, an image projects itself as though on a plane in front of itself. It is visible instantaneously, as in a painting, not in duration. Once I placed this head next to a figure I loved well of about the same size by Degas, a late figure of a woman drawing herself. Irresistibly, the Giacometti drew one's attention away from the Degas. I wondered how. Both were marvelous works. To look at the Degas, one's eye followed its movement in space and circled its form over a period of time, whereas the Giacometti struck one with instantaneous impact, compelling one to look at it. It reflected the fact that Giacometti did not work in the round, but only from one point of view at a time. I had seen him working scarcely 1 foot away from his model, focusing on the space between the eyes, which he had great trouble in determining. He said that if he were to look from the side, he would see at once the solution he had been searching for. During 5 months, but he refused to do this. He insisted on finding it from his own advantage point. Once he could find it, from this frontal position, the profile would find its own definition, he explained. Yet paradoxically, he found each experience of appearance discrete from the other. If I look at you full face, I forget the profile. If I look at the profile, I forget the full face. Everything becomes discontinuous. The crux of it is in that. I can never arrive at grasping the whole. Too many stages, too many levels. The human being becomes more complex, and to that same degree I fail to apprehend it. Since the first day, the mystery never ceases to grow. It is true that this head of Degas cannot be seen in the round. One cannot, as with the Degas, find a continuity in space. On the contrary, as one moves, each view is a separate projection, discontinuous from the one before, complete in itself. Yet this does not mean that it fails to become a whole, nor to represent a whole. On the contrary, it compels the attention of the spectator inescapably by the very credibility of the image it projects. The pressure to realize his vision drew Giacometti to discover this unprecedented means of projection out of the same necessity that took Cezanne so far into unexplored regions of painting, which followed and themselves gave rise to abstract art. Yet to both it was the subject matter that counted, that inspired their effort. Giacometti writes, I want to say again that in all works the subject matter is primordial, whether the artist is conscious of it or not. The greater or lesser degree of plasticity is no more than a sign of the greater or lesser degree of obsession the artist has for his subject. The form is always commensurate with this obsession. In speaking of Cezanne, he insists he had to create new means. Gradually, little by little, he had to create these means to express himself. It was thus that he spoke of seeing reality in terms of cubes, cones, spheres. It is quite clear that for him these cubes, cones, and spheres were nothing but the means for him to approach a little bit closer to reality, that the presentation of the mountain or the apple was the essential thing. To him the apple on the table is always, and by a long shot, beyond every possibility of presentation. He could only bring himself a little closer. That is why, at the end of his life, he only spoke of studies, small studies, in his approach to this. How close in spirit were these two artists? I find it astonishing that this head of Diego, despite its hallucinatory character, reveals Giacometti's consciousness of Cezanne. This tiny live head is not a solid head with a skull, a head that would belong to the museums. It is compressed into an irreducible quantity, but compressed from an open structure of head and space, a transparent scaffolding, as one sees in his drawings and paintings, put together of fragments representing each moment of seeing. I find it forever mysterious that a configuration of sensible facts, abstract in themselves, mere located marks, can take on specific meaning, or rather, conversely, how a particular meaning can find an order of abstract equivalents which by virtue of their exactitude in relationship correspond, achieving not only their meaning, but precisely thereby becoming transformed into art. Flaubert, who went through Giacomettian struggles to find his mot juste, speaks of this mystery. In the harmony of the ensemble, is there not an intrinsic value, a sort of sublime force, eternal as a principle? I speak platonically. Otherwise, why is there a necessary link between the mot juste, that's the right word, and the musical word? Or why is it that if one goes far enough in the compressing of a thought, one arrives at producing a line of poetry? Both feelings and images are thus governed by the law of numbers, and what appears to be the form is actually the content. Giacometti brought his mot juste of drawing, arrived at through an excruciating exigency of precision, and reaching a correspondence rarely equaled, places this head where he wants it to be, projecting its image onto a plane, both metaphysical and visual. But the image, as in late Rembrandt self-portraits, gives the impression, finally, of breaking through this plane, this painstakingly created plane of art, into reality itself. This small head of Diego is not merely a work of art. It seems to me something else as well, something magical, which I have not otherwise experienced in quite the same way. It is an uncanny presence. When this head of Diego first came to our house, it was strangely disquieting, as though there were literally a new presence. When one went out, there was the feeling he had been left behind, excluded. Forgetting, one would return to find him there, in possession of the room. Conversations would suddenly stop, embarrassed. He could hear. This continued for about a year until we became more accustomed. But always and again, there is the shock of seeing this head. With the impact of the first time, it never diminishes. Giacometti tasted a strange power. He was able to make an image that was more than a mere semblance, that became a sort of magical substitute, or as he put it, a double. This idea fascinated him throughout his life. He found it realized in those works of art he most responded to, and which he first mentions in his account of the trip to Venice in his youth, the three girls he saw in Padua and their reflection in certain works of art. All those works seemed to me like reconstituted doubles of the three girls in Padua. This image of the three girls, what was there in it that he found matched in those works of art? He had gone on to describe his impression. They seemed to me immense, beyond all concept of measure, and all their movements appeared charged with a terrible violence. In an interview he once stated, "This is what astonishes me, even in the most insignificant head, the least violent, the head of the most nondescript character, the most flaccid, one in a state of mental deficiency. If I start intending to draw this head, to paint it, or rather to sculpt it, it all becomes transformed into a tense form, and always it seems to me of an extreme violence, contained, as though the form of that person always surpasses what that person is. And there is always this sort of kernel of violence, which is not unlikely, as a matter of fact. It seems plausible enough to me that this is how it can exist at all, why it does exist, why it is not pulverized, crushed. There has to be a force for it to maintain itself." Giacometti grasped this force. He won out against the invasion of space, the threat of encroaching void, the sense of dispersal that always assailed him, by a desperate effort to compress the form until it became an entity so condensed, so tightly constructed, as to withstand those threats and to hold captive within it the very life force of the subject. As I look at the head of Diego before me, aside from the arresting beauty of the image projected, I have the sense of an enduring existence, an eternality of being, beyond particular expression. Just now the sun has come through the window, illuminating the face, intensifying the image. I stop, awed by the full impact of Alberto Giacometti's vision. All the years of this man's life, so devastatingly focused on the effort of creation, have produced these few images unlike anything ever seen before, and in some extraordinary way alive. Giacometti often dwelt on this magical potential in art. In African sculpture, oceanic and primitive sculpture, to those who looked at it, it was damned well the double of what it represented, or rather a god that inspired fear or admiration. Strange, the first Egyptian sculptures that were imported to Greece had the gesture of walking. The Greeks tied them up at night so they wouldn't get away. They believed it possible that they might come to life. In the Middle Ages, people wondered what a statue of the Virgin really was, or the figures on a cathedral. Even today, I think that to a great many people, a piece of sculpture is an object bordering on the divine, that one worships, that one fears, which has damned well become a double. But he adds, for us, that's no longer possible, I'm afraid. To me, this is precisely what Giacometti often did achieve. For Giacometti, art was either ressemblant, that is, true to life, or like, lifelike, or it was not, and this was the crucial factor. So-called realism lacked this resemblance entirely. A realistic painting is one that has too little reality to have acquired style. The trouble with it is that it resembles nothing at all. Art that did achieve the semblance he found essential. Did achieve the semblance he found essential had an extreme measure of style. He spoke of going into a gallery at a Venice Biennale in which there was nothing but abstract or non-objective paintings. The room had large windows opening out into the trees. To Giacometti, the Mondrians, and they alone were true to life, could stand up to the trees. For me, the greatest invention fuses with the greatest resemblance. He elaborated on this. The works of the past that I find the most ressemblant are those that are considered the least, the furthest from it. I mean stylized art, Chaldea, Egypt, Byzantium, the Fayum, some Chinese things, Christian miniature of the Middle Ages, are not at all what one calls realism. The most faithful vision is presented through style. Of course, no one ever intended to create a style. To the Egyptians, that wouldn't have made any sense at all. They translated a vision of reality as closely as possible. To us, Egypt has a style because we see differently. But for them, there was only one way of seeing the world, their own. The same with prehistoric artists, those of the Romanesque period. For the Polynesians, they had no choice. There was only one valid vision, their own. In contradiction to this, today one is aware of all possible visions, and one considers as style those visions that belong to a particular time and place. I know that if I arrive at making a head a little as I see it, of course you understand I've never accomplished this, it will inevitably become for others what one calls style. In this period of realization, 1947 to 1952, Giacometti seemed to the world to have created a style. When the vision that had determined this began to fade, he proclaimed that he was fed up with the extreme attenuation of his figures and heads. He did, however, find a droll justification for having made them so. One day I was taking a piece of sculpture to an exhibition. I picked it up with one hand and placed it in a taxi, noticing how light it was. I have always been fundamentally irritated by those life-size pieces of sculpture that take 5 brawny men to lift. Irritated because a man walking in the street doesn't weigh anything, certainly much less than the same man dead. It was precisely the weightlessness that I was unconsciously trying to get. Now in 1953, he set out to, quote, carve more of the fat off of space, as he put it. He wanted to copy more faithfully, to achieve more actual volume. This brought about figures that escaped the previous style. They were short, chunky, with large protruding breasts. They seemed to me to have remained clay-bound, losing their power of projection, and with it the compelling sense of presence. But the 50s were largely a transitional period. It was less and less figures that sustained his interest as the decade progressed. An exception was the group of female figures in 1956 called Women of Venice, made for the Biennale of that year. And in 1959, he was commissioned to people the plaza of the Chase Manhattan Bank in New York City. This led to some figures on a larger scale than he had made before. But having never been to New York, he could not actually visualize the scale. After a year, he gave it up. It's not worth the trouble, he said. I gave up doing them because the eye can't take in such large things all at once. I decided it would be more useful for me to do heads. And heads it was that obsessed him during the remaining years of his life. I don't know what's wrong with me. I'm only interested in heads now, and there's nothing harder than doing a head. And it doesn't get any easier, it just gets harder all the time. Matisse has pointed out that when an artist who has arrived no longer feels the necessity of getting back to search from time to time, he begins to go around in circles, repeating himself, until by this very repetition his curiosity is extinguished. I think this was a period of search for Giacometti, of returning to the sources. There were marvelous realizations, heads of Diego, portraits painted, but for Giacometti, I think it was a decade of increasing difficulty. It might seem as though his desire to copy more closely were a contradiction to his previous formulations concerning style. Not only did he reject his previous style, but he wanted to copy with as little artistic transposition as possible, risking to be totally banal, and failing, he said, even there. I am totally incapable, he insisted, of doing what is usually done, and by anyone in the academy, were it merely to copy a jug. I don't know how to copy a jug. But this was what attempting to get back to the sources meant. The effort to relinquish the artistic transformations already arrived at, as they had become intrinsic to his vision, to seek to recover an innocence of seeing that would allow as much impact from observation as possible before what he observed became absorbed into his own vision. Of course, this effort to come upon nature unawares, so to speak, as though it were not he himself observing, was again an impossibility to pursue. He himself admitted, an object, a person, are always seen by someone. There is no such thing as objective reality. There is no need to interpret, to add. Whatever I do, this cup I am drawing, as I see it, will be both cup and myself. It's I who have seen it, and whatever I do is my seeing that is on the paper. When I work, I never think of expressing myself. I say to myself, copy the cup, and that's all. Nevertheless, in the end, it's always my cup. One cannot escape the subjective. But he set up a tension in trying to do so, in never taking his past, his style, his means, his own perception, nor anything about the cup for granted. Always he pushed against the known, trying to see past it, to see newly, always newly again. I think he did. I think that was the wonder. By pressing toward reality as openly as possible, unarmed, divested of all he could rely on from past experience, he was able to renew himself in an extraordinary way. Quote, everything is so terribly new, he would say. If I were to sail on a ship toward lands never seen before, and come upon islands and people more and more unexpected, it could never be a more exciting adventure than this. How in such circumstances could I possibly care about exhibitions, about the results of my work? All I ask is to go on and on. During the 50s, Giacometti's fame grew throughout the world, and the material return from his work increased commensurately. It would be impossible to imagine anyone less affected. True, his tiny domain on the Rue Hippolyte Mandon was somewhat extended by adjoining rooms on the narrow courtyard, but the outside plumbing remained the same, and few possessions ever came to encumber these modest rooms. The Giacometti ménage, as my husband and I came to know it in 1960, consisted of Alberto, Diego, and Annette, Alberto's wife. Occasionally another would be caught in Alberto's web to pose, as were David Sylvester and Isako Yanahara at this time. This household could hardly be called a domestic one, since, aside from work and sleep, the daily life took place in restaurants and cafes. It was easy for a temporary victim to join in. Annette Arne, whom Alberto had met in Geneva during the war, had later come to Paris. They were married in 1949. The two remaining studios on the courtyard were gradually appropriated for storage and for Diego's own work, as well as some of what he did for Alberto. Diego's entire life was dedicated to his brother. Often after Alberto's long nights of labor, Diego would come in the morning to make a mold of the result before it was destroyed in process. He did much of the casting, the bronzes. He posed interminably. Many of Alberto's most realized works were the heads and busts of Diego. The two brothers were extremely close. The first time Alberto brought home 1,000,000 francs, he told us, there was rejoicing. I met Diego and he went out on the town to celebrate with wild extravagance. When he brought back several million, there was celebration again. But after that, he complained no matter what he brought in, no notice was taken of it at all. What need had they, he explained, of money? With their simple taste, there was no need of more than they already had. Life continued unchanged. This life of Alberto's was outwardly as routine and habit-bound as it was inwardly dramatic. He usually got up around 2 in the afternoon, went always to the same cafe a block away on the Rue d'Alésia, inevitably stopping on the way to rediscover the sky and the acacia trees. Everything looks different today. Everything is more beautiful, he would say. At the cafe, he had the same breakfast consisting mostly of coffee and cigarettes, and read the newspapers. His view of current events was typically sharp and ironic, but as countless drawings on newspapers reveal, he never neglected his chief activity for very long at a time. I was fascinated to observe that even when he had not put pen to paper, as he looked across the room or spoke with friends, he was going through the motions of drawing with his forefinger against his thumbnail. Little of Giacometti's life remained separate from his identification with his work. After breakfast, he would go back to the studio to start the day's work. As he cheerfully proclaimed one day to Yanahara, "Here we go back to the galleys, the endless galleys, the galleys of the condemned." In the early evening, there would be a break for lunch at the same cafe, hard-boiled eggs being an inevitable part of the repast. After this came the evening posing session. Between midnight and 2 a.m., Alberto would go to Montparnasse for dinner. Often he relaxed for a time, read, wrote letters, visited with friends. Here one could see this man with the extraordinary face, a face ravaged yet shockingly beautiful. There was an ambience of heightened irritability and anxiety about him. He might, in a rather hoarse voice, be lamenting the hopelessness of his situation, the futility of all his efforts, the wall before which he found himself. But an ironic or humorous observation would rescue this soliloquy from self-pity or sentimentality of which he had not a trace. His sly sense of the comic was as cruelly self-seeing as it was penetrating of others. He would often enjoy pushing aside habitual tenets of thought, outraging the conventional or naive. Yet there was still about Alberto, along with the Parisian sophisticate, a residue of his Swiss mountain background, the Alberto Stampa, something untouched, almost quaint, something extremely courteous, gentle, endearing. The boundless affection he evoked in those who knew him was quite unique. Small envies and partisanships withered in the face of a man so consumed, so self-critical and indifferent to success, so humble before the magnitude of his purpose. At times, Giacometti was not as negative about himself. One night, when the evening session had gone well, he was quite elated. Amused at himself, he observed that his attitude was that of a young man with his whole life ahead of him, as though he had all the time to do what he wanted to do. But then he added, this is not as unrealistic as it might seem, because in 1/2 hour it is possible to go further than in all the previous hours of one's life combined. Therefore, his optimism was justified. Verbal introspection did not always dominate his conversation. He could be a great causeur, alert to countless subjects, ironic, witty, and always surprising. He also had a game of challenging his own point of view, of becoming his own most formidable opponent. On one occasion, we heard him build up an invincible argument against his entire approach to the imagined participation of Picasso. It started with Picasso's claim that one cannot possibly see a tree, but only the ways in which art has presented a tree. He elaborated on this point of view extensively. Then he recalled an incident in Maloya, where his small nephew had come running into the house, roaring with laughter. "Guess what Severini is painting beside the lake," he yelled. Giacometti tried to guess: an elephant, a giraffe, the most unlikely things. Finally he gave up. The child exclaimed, "He's painting the lake, and it's already there." This really worried Alberto. He continued to bolster the argument against himself, compelling one in the end to clear, "But you don't believe any of this." Instantly he retorted, "Of course not, or I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing." Pierre Snyders quotes Giacometti as saying, "I would give all my work for a conversation," and observed how he often prolonged the time of talk to stave off indefinitely the time of separation and solitude. He did insist that friends meant a great deal to him, that solitude was not at all a theme of his work, nor anything he ever thought about when he worked. Actually, the procedure of his work, as it frequently... Oh, that went backwards again. It's supposed to be a... I don't know what's happening. It goes backwards, doesn't it? Yes, way backwards, way backwards. Actually, the procedure of his work, as it frequently took place with someone posing, went on in great part to the accompaniment of a stream of conversation, such as James Lord, or maybe that was the... I think so. Yes, I think that black one was right. The one just before this. That's right. Good stuff. Actually, nothing. That was fine. Actually, the procedure of his work, as it frequently took place with someone posing, went on in great part to the accompaniment of a stream of conversation, such as James Lord and Isako Yanahara have recorded. It is true that resistance to work, to the struggle of creating, was as painfully familiar to him as to most serious artists, yet he had a disciplined habit of work. He worried even when he had no wish to work, and he worked even when he had no wish to work, and the tide turned again. The positive drove away the resistance. After Montparnasse, he would return to his studio and work alone for the rest of the night. As the 50s progressed, as Giacometti's sphere of influence widened throughout the world, at the center within himself, the way was becoming more and more difficult. The beginning of a worsening period. No, this is way ahead. Yeah, we should have had the machine I had upstairs. Well, at least he places a night during the posing of Isako Yanahara. That could, yes, that's fine. When he worked on a portrait, he focused more and more obsessively on the face. There was far less environment than in earlier paintings. He seemed to be banging his head against a wall that seldom yielded, but he worked on and on in a frenzy of insistence. It was in heads that he found the very source of life that he sought to instill in his work. One has the desire to sculpt a living person, but there is no doubt that as far as the life within them is concerned, what makes them alive is the regard, the look of the eyes. It's very important. If the look, that is to say life, becomes the essential concern, then it is the head that is of primary importance. The rest of the body is reduced to the role of antennae, making life possible for the person, the life that exists in the cranium. But to capture this look seemed to him all but impossible. If I see a head from far away, I have the impression of a sphere. If I see it close up, it ceases to be a sphere and becomes an extreme complexity and depth. One enters into the being. Everything becomes transparent. One sees through a skeleton. The chief impossibility is to grasp the whole in what one could call the details, so that I think only of the eyes, only the eyes. I feel that if I could arrive, even approximately, at copying an eye at least the least bit, then I would have the whole head. Only it seems quite impossible. I don't directly think about the look, but rather the form, the appearance of the eye. If I could grasp the form of the eye, it would resemble the look. In seeking this life within the form of that person which surpasses what that person is, he was not involved, at least on a conscious level, with the character or expression of the particular person. James Lord said he did not feel that any rapport whatsoever existed between Giacometti and the individual nature of the model, not in his work in any case. Giacometti said, I have enough trouble with the outside without bothering about the inside. Giacometti would also say, I recognize my models even less than I do other people, or that the head before him was as alien as a wolf's head. One night during dinner, Annette asked him why he was staring at her so persistently. He said it was the first time he had seen her that day, though she had been posing for him all afternoon. In reaction to what critics and writers said about the metaphysical content of his work, he grumbled, it's a monstrous misunderstanding. To me, it is nothing of the sort. It is purely optical exercise. I try to represent a head as I see it. Once I said to him that I was too preoccupied with the difficulties of constructing in my own work to think about expression. He answered instantly, that's all there is. It is particularly apparent in his drawings and paintings that the construction of his head consists of a maze of geometric elements, a rectangle. I think the next. That's it. A rectangle defining the plane of the forehead. Spherical lines and triangulations enmeshed throughout. There are several now. Everything is a sphere, a cone, or a cylinder, it's true. Too bad I'm not the first to have made that observation, he remarked. Cezanne was right. But although, no, that's, oh, yeah. That's fine. I mean, it's black, yeah. But although he constructed with the classical vocabulary of geometry, his encounters with space were almost melodramatic in character. Suppose I want to represent you at a normal distance, the distance that separates us while we are talking. It's too close. You are something that looms over me like a cliff. Your head is like an unidentifiable object, a star falling out of space. If I want to see you, I must move away, make you small. It is a matter of inches, but inches are infinities. To this master of scale, this magician of space, inches were far too crude a measure. In Giacometti's tiny domain on the Rue Philippe Mandon, there was all of space to explore and to conquer, and he held the key to its mysterious properties. It is probable that no space has ever been more minutely felt or measured than this one. So sensitized was he to its slightest differentiation, so exquisite was his scale of measure, that this tiny room grew more and more vast as it became saturated with the findings of his days. If you want to measure a stretch of road or a room, he said, a yardstick has a certain utility value, but in itself it measures nothing. You can put the whole world in the length of a yardstick. It can be tiny or immense. It's the same way in painting. In the space of a yard, you can paint 3 bottles or an infinite landscape. And even in painting that still life with 3 bottles, you understand the infinity of space. It is as vast as the space from here to the other end of Paris, or from here to the moon. There's no difference. When he went away from the studio, and when he came back, might seem closer to its actual size at first when he returned, but as soon as he started to work, it would grow enormous again. Now it seems to me twice as big as when I came back a month ago. Space, he claimed, was easier to render through painting than through sculpture. Thanks to its 2 dimensions, one is at ease. Everything is fiction. Giacometti's concern with scale, his mastery of it, are all the more dramatic at a time when size, in a literal sense, dominates visual art, having replaced the fiction of space. Even Giacometti's most minuscule figures, and the matchbox figures, project scale in a sense that holds its own with works of any size. To arrive at scale, not the impact of size nor an intellectual idea of scale, but its mysterious actuality, involved all the elements of Giacometti's genius, all the complexities of his consciousness, and the obsession for meticulous distinctions of measure so particularly his. If one is inclined to underestimate this mania for accuracy, one has only to read what Isako Yanahara recalls about posing. The place for the chair is marked in red paint. This makes him very nervous. When I take my pose on the chair, having carefully placed it on the marks, he asks me, "Are you sure you are in the right place?" I assure him that I am, but in vain. Anxiously he gets up to make sure for himself that the chair is in position. It's not only the location of the chair that makes him nervous. The height of his canvas always torments him as well. In the case of the chair, it's enough to follow the marks as they are painted, but the height of the canvas is not something fixed in advance, because the right height varies according to the progress of the work. One can adjust the height of the canvas from one notch to another of the easel, but Giacometti, never satisfied with such approximate levels, places a bit of the clay he uses for sculpture under the canvas. In the course of the work, if he finds that the height of the canvas is wrong, he adds or takes away some of the clay. Since the distance which separates the painter from the model is determined by the intangible location of the chair, he can only paint the model at a certain position of the canvas and in a certain size if he wants to paint him exactly as he sees him. In consequence, the change in position of the canvas determines the change of space around the portrait. The changes in the features of the face call for a change in the space around the face and necessitates a change in the height of the canvas. But how to find the exact height? I wish I had a slide of the paintings where he changes the size of the picture plane as he goes along, which he also did. James Lord, in recounting his experience of posing, notes, "When he started to work again, he kept insisting that my head was too far to the right or the left or too high or too low. No matter how I moved it, it seemed to be wrong. Finally, we looked at the legs of the chair and found that they were half an inch off of the marks painted on the floor. But that made all the difference," he said. From that time on, he himself always carefully checked the position of the chair before he began to work. So it was that Giacometti kept his models impaled, while he relentlessly continued to do what challenged him most: portraits. Portraits in clay, in paint, in pencil. Portraits of his various victims, his wife Annette, his brother Diego, his friend Caroline, Yanahara, and finally Lotau. All these entered into collaboration with him in his quest. James Lord spoke of feeling himself an active participant, not an apple as Madame Cezanne was for her husband. Alberto agreed. The model is very important. Yanahara and Caroline feel the same way as you do about it. The posing is an active participation in the work. It's not easy either, I know. But Genet felt that posing was completely passive, and he stopped posing because he felt he was being transformed into an object. I thought that was a very literary attitude. In late years, Annette posed somewhat less. I don't want to pose anymore the way I used to, because one's whole life gets swallowed up into it. Giacometti himself admitted. In a way, it is rather abnormal that instead of living, one spends one's time trying to copy ahead, immobilizing someone on a chair every afternoon, the same person for 5 years, trying to copy them without succeeding and still going on. It's not an activity one would call exactly normal, do you think? One has to belong to a certain social environment for it to be even tolerated. It's an activity that's useless to the whole of society. It's a purely individual satisfaction, extremely egotistical, and basically annoying even to the person himself. Yet he was driven on by the sense of reality, which seemed ever more closely within his grasp, transcending all else. And it seemed to him now that art had never sufficiently reflected this. In the past, I would go to the Louvre, and the paintings and sculpture impressed me as sublime. I loved them to the degree to which they gave me something more than what I saw in reality. I damn well found them more beautiful than reality itself. Today, if I go to the Louvre, I can't resist looking at the people looking at the works of art, to such a point that the last times I've been to the Louvre, I have fled, literally fled. All those works had such a miserable air, such a pathetic approach, so precarious, a staggering advance through the ages in every possible direction, but extremely makeshift. Attempts, that's all. But oh, how marvelous. Through the tremendous efforts of the 50s, Giacometti reached a new point of realization in the 60s. The revelations, his work had brought him, had sustained this effort despite its slow and painful progress. He had continued without pause because, he said, it is as though reality were continually behind curtains one is tearing away. There is still another, always another. But I have the impression, or the illusion, that I do make progress each day. It is this that motivates me to act as though one ought damned well to get to understand the very kernel of life. His late works approach this understanding. Despite his protestations to the contrary, and again on a level beneath his consciousness, he reached the most profound human insight. The surrealist ambience is gone, and the vision that achieved such aesthetic innovation, such an extreme degree of style, is gone as well. These give way to an almost artless human confrontation with the subject before him, with the human countenance gazing back at him. The late heads, the poignant heads of Annette, the stark, rugged heads of Diego, the heart-rending heads of Lothar. To me, these project a most profound sense of the tragic in human existence. They stare out far ahead, these faces, survivors of the human experience, indomitable in their will to live, to endure. This was his very last work. Through Giacometti's inexhaustible effort, he drew the energy to continue, and despite recurrent rounds of despair, he had the times of vertiginous anticipation, of realization, of astounding revelation. This was what sustained and renewed him. His energy was scarcely derived from physical sources. Rather, his body was consumed, burned out in the overriding pursuit that drove him on. He took bad care of himself in the way he ate and slept. He smoked incessantly, pushed himself beyond the point of physical exhaustion during the interminable hours of work. All this would have destroyed him had there not been the tremendous return, the live force renewed in him as his work advanced. Once I saw this. My husband and I stopped to pick up a letter sent us in his care. We interrupted a session with Lothar. Giacometti graciously suggested that we all go to the cafe. Of course, we declined, regretting to have intruded even for a moment, though I should have loved to remain invisibly. Giacometti was transfigured, his face illuminated. There is no question in my mind that this transcendent state that he reached at times when he worked was the source of life for Giacometti. It seemed to me a terrible misfortune that fame, with its insistent demands, inevitably imposed itself on his life, perhaps fatally, for all his desire to continue working undisturbed. A concurrence of several major exhibitions in as many countries brought about an interruption of about 6 months in 1965. In the summer, he went to London to prepare an exhibition at the Tate Gallery. Then, after so many years of refusing to go to New York, he saw no reason to risk his life on a plane. He went by boat to arrive for the closing of his exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art. During that visit, he became newly interested in the Chase Manhattan project, having seen the building and the space. After this, he went to Denmark for another exhibition. Finally to Bern to receive an honorary award from the President of Switzerland. During this entire time, the rhythm of his life was disrupted. In Bern, he suffered a sort of seizure which alarmed him. On his return to Paris, he saw a doctor. 2 years before, he had been operated on for cancer of the stomach. Each year thereafter, he was obliged to return to Chur, where the operation had taken place, for a checkup. He decided to do this now, to get it over with before really settling down to work again in Paris. On the way to Chur, he went to Hamburg. He was extremely lively there, Annette said. She could not keep up with him, but went to bed while he explored the red light district of the city. But in Chur he was hospitalized, not for cancer, but for his heart. What he needed, they said, was rest. Although by then it may have been too late, rest was certainly not a possible condition for Giacometti. On the contrary, what he needed, I am convinced, was the restoration of his life to where he had access to his own resources. In further alienation from these, trapped, immobilized, a prey to his consciousness of defeat, without its only antidote, his work, life ebbed away. Within 5 weeks, he died. In January 1966, a group from many far places joined Alberto Giacometti. He was buried in the small cemetery near his father, his mother, his younger sister, and his cousin, the painter Augusto Giacometti. The vast and silent white landscape closed over him again. The sophisticated group of mourners looked with wonder at the country from which their Parisian friend had come to them, to leave them now alone in the desolate cold. No one had ever touched them quite as had this extraordinary man. To many less personally involved, his death was still a crucial loss. So long as Giacometti had been there, in his corner of Paris, pursuing his relentless effort, he had sustained them in theirs. But what he left behind is there, those presences miraculously imbued with life. His work, as Diego simply remarked, ça reste, that remains. It's